Good to be speaking to you once more. A problem for a lot of women, I think, and then probably men as well, in each morning is to decide what to wear. But Hannah has got a similar problem, but a little different. Her problem is what is wear. Because she has a small flat in Lancaster and her home by the sea in Awarvo near Gdynia, and because she obviously lives here in Warsaw as well, she's never quite sure where any of her clothes are. So yes, she does have that problem of all women, what to wear, but she also has that problem of what is wear. Now, for all of us in our lives, there are two questions, what and where. What does God want of us? How can we become the people that he wants us to be and fulfill his mission, which he wants us to carry out? What? And also where? Where are we to do it? Now, Moses had a similar question, I think, when he was trying to decide what God wanted of him. What did God want him to do, and where did God want him to do it? And perhaps Moses didn't like what he was hearing. And then, of course, he had the experience of God speaking to him through the burning bush. And God told him what? To lead the people out of slavery, out of Egypt, to a promised land. Now, Moses was like many of us, I think, a bit insecure. And so he said to the voice, the presence, he said, "Who shall I tell them sent me? Who are you?" And the voice came back and said, "I am who I am." Say, "I am has sent you." I am the name that God called himself. And in our gospel reading, we have just heard about Jesus saying, I am the bread of life. And it followed, of course, the feeding of the 5,000. John, the gospel writer, is having Jesus speak of what God is. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. And he's saying, God is a light to the world. Jesus says, I am the gate. And he's saying, God is the gate. Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. God is a good shepherd. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and I am the life. God is the resurrection and the life. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth and the life. And he's saying, God is the way, the truth and the life. Jesus said, I am the true vine. God is the true vine. And today, as I said, we thought about Jesus saying, I am the bread of life. God is the bread of life. But actually it's more than that, more wonderful than that, because Jesus is saying, God is our bread of life, our way, the truth and the life, our resurrection and the life. God is our bread of life. Last Saturday was the 1st of August, and here in Warsaw we remembered the uprising in 1944. And it's very impressive how the city as a whole remembers the terrible sacrifice made by so many people at that time. We went with some people from church to a military cemetery, and I can't quite say how it should be said, but it's something like Powązki. And there were so many, many people there, so many people taking flowers and placing candles on the graves. There was the singing of the national anthem, there was the firing of the gun salute, there was the laying of the wreaths on the different memorials to the people who had died. And you remember, of course, that Poland was occupied during the war by the Germans, and it was a terrible time for them. And it was in 1944 that they decided that they wanted to show that Poland was an independent country. The Russians were approaching Warsaw. They were just over the river Vistula. They were waiting to come in. And so the Polish army, which was the largest underground army in Europe during the war, decided that it was time to show that Poland was an independent country. And so at the beginning of August in 1944, there was this rising. And it resulted over a few weeks in Polish army losses of 36,000 and the slaughter of nearly 200,000 civilians and the expulsion of another 700,000 people from the city. It was a most terrible time. And following it, the Germans went through Warsaw and destroyed every building. They blew them up and then they set fire to make sure that they could not be repaired and were not a place for hiding. Perhaps 90% of the city was completely destroyed. So last Saturday we thought about that. Now, where is the bread of life in all that? What is the bread of life? Jesus saying, I am the bread of life. How does that help us make sense of that terrible, tragic suffering? As we walk through Warsaw today, we see a very vibrant city. It is very much coming alive. It has come alive. And a lot of the buildings which were completely destroyed have been remade. They have been brought back to what they were. They have followed photographs and Canaletto paintings to actually recreate the old town here in Warsaw as it was. It's been a wonderful thing. And in a sense, it is about the bread of life. It is saying that the spirit of love, the spirit of sacrifice, can never be destroyed, no matter what. And the defiance of the people who were willing to fight for their freedom comes through to us now. Warsaw is very different from what it was before the Second World War, but is very much alive and very beautiful. One of the things, of course, which kept the people going was music. And Warsaw is a city of music. Very often you can hear the music of Chopin as you walk through the streets. And it was that music and song that helped to keep the people going. It helped to preserve their identity and passion and self-belief. It was the bread of life. But of course, bread does not occur naturally in nature, in the world. Grains have to be ground into flour, dough has to be leavened and kneaded and left to rest, and then rise and kneaded again and baked. Bread is a wonderful metaphor for the struggles and the imperfections and individualities of life, for no two loaves are exactly the same. Bread is in a sense a marvelous marriage of creativity and wrestling with hard things. In war-torn Poland, a loaf of bread was sometimes quite literally the difference between life and death. People knew what you were saying when you talked about the bread of life. And many thousands, of course, of non-Jewish Poles gave bread to their Jewish neighbours. And they did many other wonderful things to shield them, even when they faced the death penalty themselves for such actions. One lovely story is that after the war, when many orphans who'd lost both their parents in the fighting and in all that had happened in the war were placed into care, it was found that many of these orphans could not sleep at night. And the psychologist at the time found a solution. Each child was given, before sleeping, some bread to hold, not to eat, but bread just to hold. And knowing that they had bread enough for the next day, allowed such orphans to find restful sleep at last. Such is the power of bread, not just in our stomachs, but in our minds and our imaginations. God speaks to us and supports us and is very close to us in the broken and struggling places of our lives. Perhaps more realistically to us, in a sense, than in our times of joy and triumph. So when we look for the places in our lives that God has fed us with his very self, with the bread of life, we should not be surprised to find it is in difficult times. Thankfully, not such traumatic times as the Warsaw Rising. But God gives us in his very self the bread of life in times of spiritual and physical, literal and spiritual, famine and hunger. That bread may be a word of kindness or advice. It might be a sympathetic shoulder to cry on. It might be a good book or a TV program that changed the direction of our life. The bread of life comes in many shapes and sizes. But what makes the bread of life so distinctive, what makes it so precious, is its capacity to transform what appears dead and ruined into what is vital and creative. So the important question is not really what to wear or what is where. But the only questions for us, the ultimate questions are, what does God want of us? What are we meant to become? And where are we meant to serve? And so I pray this week that you may be so open to the bread of life, to the love of God, that you may truly know what God wants of you, what he wants you to become, and where he wants you to live and serve in your life. May God bless you very greatly.